Shabbat Shalom. More than the 19.8 seconds of lightning fast speed, 50 years later, it is the 90 seconds of motionless and statuesque protest that we will remember this week. The date was October 16th, 1968. The setting was the Olympic Games in Mexico City. The event was a 200-meter race. The world record would be set and the gold medal received by Tommie Smith, who was joined on the awards podium by bronze medalist and college teammate John Carlos, who in his final strides was overtaken by the Australian Peter Norman and still holder of the world record for Olympian most frequently cropped out of an iconic photograph. While the trigger for the protest began with the readmission of an apartheid South Africa to the Olympic Games, it came to encompass racial injustices in Africa and America writ large. In the run-up to the race, the rumors of potential protests by the athletes were swirling, and Smith, Carlos, and their teammates were subjected to tactics of intimidation from the Olympic Committee and even their own coaching staff. The decision was made to let each winning athlete choose their own form of protest upon victory. The first test, 100-meter, did not bode well. Jim Hines and Charles Green, gold and silver winners respectively, stood stolidly as a Star-Spangled Banner played, with Green going on quickly to sign a professional football contract. Upon their victory, Tommie Smith and John Carlos were taken to the dressing room beneath the stadium to await the presentation of their medals, where Smith produced the famous black gloves, right for him, left for Carlos, a focal point for the gesture to follow. "The national anthem is a sacred song to me," Smith said to Carlos. "This can't be sloppy, it has to be clean and abrupt." Moments later, with a black scarf around Smith's neck, human rights buttons on their lapels, and black stocking feet, both men stood with their head bowed and fists raised for the duration of the 90-second American anthem. As Smith would later explain, "My raised hand stood for the power in Black America. Carlos's raised hand stood for the unity of Black America. Together they formed an arch of unity and power. The black scarf around my neck stood for Black pride. The black socks with no shoes stood for Black poverty in racist America. The totality of our effort was the regaining of Black dignity." The response, some of you may recall, was immediate. The U.S. Olympic Committee warned all the athletes that severe penalties would follow any further protests, and Smith and Carlos were suspended from the Olympic team and given 48 hours to leave Mexico. In the days to follow, the image of Smith and Carlos with fist pumps in the air would be reproduced on the front pages of every newspaper, and in the decades to follow, in every high school American history textbook. One of, if not the most iconic images of social protest on record. Students of sports history know full well that our present-day debates over sports and social protest are only the latest chapter in a storied history that began long ago. As Ecclesiastes taught, "Ein chadash tachat hashamesh," there is nothing new under the sun. As much as this week's anniversary of Carlos and Smith's famed protest of '68 is an opportunity to revisit their courage, it is also a reminder to us that the kneeling football players and hoodie-wearing basketball players of our era walk in the footsteps of those who came before. Depending on your athletic passions and the time into which you were born, your points of reference will vary. In his study on Black athletic activism, sports sociologist Harry Edwards identifies 4 waves. The first, beginning with Jesse Owens' victory at the '36 Olympics in Nazi Germany, or Joe Louis's defeat of Max Schmeling, as Black athletes sought to establish the basic legitimacy of their athletic prowess. The second wave, roughly from 1946 to 1965, can be characterized as a struggle for access, with athletes like Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby in baseball, Woody Strode and Kenny Washington in football, and Earl Lloyd and Chuck Cooper in basketball. The third wave of athletic activism, to include the '68 Olympics, was led by such athletes as Bill Russell, Jim Brown, and Arthur Ashe, who leveraged their talent, success, and celebrity towards seeking dignity, equality, and justice for black people across society, an era embodied most famously by Muhammad Ali's famous declaration, "I ain't got no problem with them Viet Cong," his refusal to serve in Vietnam, and the stripping of his boxing license and title. I was reminded, if you'll permit me a brief digression, of one of the more underappreciated chapters of third wave activism when the AFL scheduled its 1965 All-Star game in New Orleans. As the African-American players arrived, not only were they left stranded at airports having been denied taxi service, but they were refused admittance to night spots and restaurants. Led by Buffalo Bills end Ernie Warlick, the 21 African-American players met in the Roosevelt Hotel and announced that they would not play in an All-Star game hosted in New Orleans, prompting the game's cancellation. It's a story I was reminded of this past summer when my friend, Dr. Chris Warlick, the late Ernie Warlick's son, now a professor of urology at the University of Minnesota, reminded me of the incident of his father and was generous enough to share a draft of Warlick's press conference speech that historic day, copies of which I've left in the back of the sanctuary for you to read at the end of services, and which we will study together with the teens this afternoon. But by the 1980s and 90s, the social movements of the prior decades began to wane. The loss of leaders with the moral and organizational authority of an MLK Jr. or Malcolm X, the reluctance of certain athletes to take on leadership roles, think of Michael Jordan's "Republicans Gotta Buy Gym Shoes Too," or Charles Barkley's "I am not a role model," and the premature presumption that America was entering a post-racial era, resulting in a short-lived hiatus of black athlete activism until, of course, the Black Lives Movement. Be it the 2012 hoodie protest of the Miami Heat, the 2015 hands up, don't shoot gesture by the 5 players on the St. Louis Rams, the I can't breathe t-shirt of LeBron James, and of course the much debated kneeling of former San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, amongst other examples, all signal the fourth wave of black athletic activism, of which we are very much in the midst to this day. By this telling, neither the protests themselves nor the response of the establishment is new. In fact, the only interesting thing about our era is that in times past, protests came at a great financial cost for athletes like Smith, Carlos, or Ali, who placed principle over profit. Today, it would seem that it's not an either-or proposition. Not all athletes are always punished for their activism. One can, it would seem, both protest and sign with a major shoe company. Now, I am no legal scholar, though I do know 1 or 2 attorneys. And from what I can make out, given that sports teams are privately owned, these are not First Amendment issues in the purest sense. Players may be able to do and say anything they want, just as owners on their part have the legal right to fire players. As to the question of whether protests in the face of the flag or national anthem is or isn't kosher, I would refer you to the concurring opinion of Justice Kennedy in Texas v. Johnson that, quote, "the flag protects even those who hold it in contempt." Or, if you like, the words of my favorite fictional American president, Andrew Shepard, who reminded us that one who would claim this to be the land of the free must concede that the symbol of our country cannot just be a flag. The symbol also has to be one of its citizens exercising his right to burn that flag in protest. Varied as the motivations and methods of protesting athletes, past and present, may be, I have to believe that for many, if not most of them, Their decision to protest as they do reflects their highest hopes for a country they love that has failed time and again to live up to the ideals and freedoms implicit in its founding documents and symbols. And while our tradition, not surprisingly, says very little about the nexus of athletics and social protest, it does, beginning this week, have plenty to say about matters of conscience. As Graham duly noted, no matter how righteous Noah may have been, his piety is circumscribed due to his unwillingness or inability to respond to the wickedness of his day. As the floodwaters rose, not only did he enter into the ark as his generation perished, but he proved unwilling, despite his privileged relationship with God, to leverage his stature towards changing either the behavior of his contemporaries or God's decree. Et ha-Elohim hithalech Noach. Noach walked with God. He was in the room, or if you will, the ark where it happened. He could have used his clout to make a difference, but he didn't. All of which is why it is not Noah, but Abraham, who we'll meet at the tail end of this week's Torah reading, who is our moral exemplar as Jews. Not only, as the Midrash explains, was Abraham willing to stand on one side of the world, while the rest of the world stood on the other, but Abraham was willing to stand in the breach and put himself at great risk for the good of others, not just as his own kin, as he would with Lot and his family, but also on behalf of those undeserving of his aid, as in the case of the wicked citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram's promise was twofold: to be the father to a great nation and to be a blessing of all humankind. Abraham understood that given his privileged relationship to God, it was incumbent upon him to use that privilege to speak truth to power towards redressing the injustices he understood in his age, even if taking a stand would come at his own expense. From our founding father Abraham to Moses' fight for freedom from within the house of Pharaoh, to Queen Esther of the royal court, to, dare we say, the privileged pulpit of Park Avenue, it is the willingness of individuals to leverage their position of privilege towards redressing the ills of society that has been the Jewish mark of moral leadership through the ages. As the Talmud teaches, anyone who is able to protest against the transgressions of one's household and does not is held accountable for the actions of the members of their household. So too, anyone who's able to protest against the transgressions of the entire world and does not is held accountable for the transgressions of the entire world. The question is not whether you agree or disagree with the causes for which athletes are or are not protesting. After all, if you do disagree, you have the self-same right to use your position of influence to advocate on behalf of your beliefs. The question is whether athletes, given the attention, wealth, and celebrity we, their complicit fan base, bestow upon them, have the right to speak out and protest on behalf of the causes in which they believe. As a Jew, one could go so far as to say that not only do they have the right, but they have the obligation to do so. As Tommy Smith and John Carlos teach us, it is the character of our deeds, not the number of our medals, that are ultimately memorialized in the judgments of history. Harry Edwards, in his 50-year retrospective on the '68 Olympics, reminds us of the 6 great movements of our country: abolition against slavery, women's suffrage, labor, civil rights, environmentalism, and gay rights. Not one of these movements, Edward writes, was initiated or had its basic concepts, methods, and goals first articulated by an elected or appointed official in conjunction with mandated duties. Not one of these movements precipitated initially out of government policy. Movements are, therefore, an imperative of democracy. This is the true meaning and relevance of the opening line of the preamble to the United States Constitution, "We the people." Important as national anthems are, as Jews, our moral compass has been wrought from those songs that call on us to stand for the things that we know are right, that remind us that we've been sitting much too long and that there's a permanent crease in our right and wrong. These are the battle hymns that date back not just to 68, but all the way back to the beginnings of our people. These are the anthems that have carried our people from generation to generation and deserve to be sung and must be sung anew again and again in our day. Shabbat Shalom.